What do you think would happen if a woman of color, dressed modestly, walked into an airport holding an economy class ticket, unaware she was about to be seen as a threat? Not because she caused a scene, not because she raised her voice, not because she did anything wrong, but simply because she didn't look like someone who had the right to ask questions. And what the airport staff didn't know was that the woman they were about to dismiss wasn't just another passenger. That morning, at an airport in Florida, Rebecca Hayes, a state legislator, showed up alone, wearing a simple black dress, carrying a small suitcase and a ticket to Jacksonville. She wasn't traveling for business. She was going to attend the funeral of her foster father, the man who raised her, taught her kindness, and once whispered to her, "You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to stand firm." But when Rebecca approached the check-in counter, the first thing she received wasn't a greeting. It was a cold, indifferent look, a brief glance, just long enough to trigger a chain of events that would soon echo across the nation. She was moved to a different seat without explanation. She was told to calm down for simply asking why. Security was called on her, and she was pulled off the flight just minutes before the memorial service for her late father. She didn't shout. She didn't resist. She just stood there and let the world see. Sometimes silence is the loudest voice of all. You're about to watch a true story, told in chronological order, packed with emotion, rich detail, and shocking twists that forced an entire country to listen. From a seemingly harmless question at a check-in counter, to the moment an entire system had to confront a truth it could no longer ignore. Does human dignity require a title to be respected? At the end of the video, we'll bring you an expert perspective on how even the smallest acts in customer service can reveal the deepest layers of organizational culture, and why Rebecca Hayes' story should never be the exception. It should be a wake-up call. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, to be shared, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. I was Rebecca. Because sometimes all it takes is one person speaking up for millions to realize they were never suffering in silence alone. 6:05 a.m. Orlando West Terminal still shimmered under dim golden lights. Outside, the sun had yet to rise above the horizon. Inside, the loudspeakers had already begun calling out the first flights of the day. But no one noticed the woman in a plain black coat, quietly pulling a small suitcase past the row of seats near Gate 17. She wasn't here on business, not today. Rebecca Hayes, Florida State Representative, didn't look like the press photos you'd usually see. No microphone, no brightly colored blazer or thick folders in hand. She wore a knee-length black dress, low heels, and her long curly hair fell gently along both cheeks. In one hand was a steaming cup of coffee, and in the other, a phone filled with unread messages from her assistant. She didn't open a single one, not because she was tired, but because a certain kind of silence was taking up all the space in her mind. A silence that was both soft and heavy. Today was the memorial for her foster father, Walter Kinsey, a former gas station attendant who lived a simple life and taught her the value of silence. Not the kind of silence that surrenders, but the kind that forces people to listen. Rebecca had been through countless hearings, spoken in front of hundreds of constituents, and debated bills still wet with ink. But today she was just a daughter who had promised to be there to say a few words for the man who wasn't her blood, but had called her daughter long before she ever called him dad. She still remembered what he said to her the year she was first elected. You don't need to speak loud to be heard. You just need to stand tall and not back down. That was why she was here, in this quiet airport before morning had fully arrived. She'd flown in from Sacramento to Florida the night before, slept only 3 hours in a budget hotel room near the airstrip. Everything had been thrown together in a rush, last-minute schedule changes, her assistant calling in sick, the airline switching boarding gates without notice. But it didn't matter. She was used to rushing. She wasn't here to be served. She was here to keep a promise. She pulled a printed ticket from her coat pocket, along with a digital copy on her phone. Flight 6172 to Jacksonville, where the memorial would be held. She arrived early, well before check-in. In her mind, she was still rehearsing the excerpt she planned to read, a short speech she had written at 2 a.m., scribbled in ballpoint pen on the back of a Starbucks receipt. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. He had no boardroom or rank. But he taught me that quiet kindness can change the world. And I'm still trying to prove him right. The suitcase rolled smoothly along the floor. Rebecca approached the counter of Atlantic Line, a no-frills airline, no business class, no private lounge, because she wanted to keep this journey simple. She had always believed that a public servant should travel like the public, eat like the public, and listen to the public. She stopped in front of the check-in counter. A young man, an airline employee, was typing something into the computer. Beside him stood a blonde woman wearing a Bluetooth earpiece, her face expressionless. Neither of them looked up. Rebecca smiled politely. "Good morning. I'm on Flight 6172 to Jacksonville. I'd like to check this bag if that's all right." The young man, his name tag read Cullen, looked up. His glance lasted only a second. Just a flicker. But she noticed it. It wasn't a greeting. It was a scan. The kind of glance she had seen before, walking into a grocery store after work in jeans, without her representative pin. Cullen tapped a few keys, frowning. I don't see your name in the system." Rebecca tilted her head. "I already checked in. Maybe the system hasn't updated yet." She held out her phone. "Here's the boarding pass code and the paid ticket." He glanced at it, frowned again. "Looks like there's been a change. You've been moved to a different seat. You'll have to wait." "Moved where?" Rebecca asked. No response. Cullen waved over a colleague, Mallory, motioning for her to come closer. Rebecca glanced at her watch. 6:31. There was still time, but her heartbeat had begun to quicken. Not from panic, but from a feeling she knew all too well. That feeling of being seen as a problem, just because she wasn't wrapped in spotlight. Mallory approached. She didn't smile, didn't make eye contact. She simply said coldly, "You've been randomly flagged for additional screening. Please present your ID again. We need to verify it." Rebecca froze. "Random? I've flown this route 3 times this year. Never had this happen." Cullen cut in, his tone flat. "If you don't cooperate, I'll have to ask you to step back so as not to disrupt the check-in area." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Her voice remained calm. "I'm just asking a question. I have a funeral to attend. I'm not yelling. I'm just asking." "Ma'am," Mallory said, "please step aside." Behind Rebecca, a few passengers began to turn their heads. Some pulled out their phones. An older woman gently shook her head, as if apologizing on someone else's behalf. Rebecca stood still, her fingers tightening slightly on the handle of her bag. Not out of anger, but because she knew this wasn't going to end here. None of them called her by name. None of them asked if they could help. None of them looked at the government-issued ID she held out, a badge identifying her as a Florida state representative, issued by the State House of Representatives, complete with photo, barcode, and a bold signature at the bottom. Cullen gave it a quick glance, then turned his face away. Mallory, the woman reviewing her documents, said nothing for a few seconds, then exhaled, softly but with an audible hint of annoyance. "Don't you understand? This is a mandatory check." Her tone was flat, robotic. Rebecca shifted slightly, not to back away, but to hold the ID more clearly in front of them. "And I'm saying I'm willing to cooperate, but I'm asking why I've been singled out. I'm a confirmed, checked-in passenger." Mallory didn't respond. Cullen leaned over and whispered something. Then he tilted his head toward the end of the counter. "Call security." He didn't say it loudly, but it was loud enough to cut through the space around Rebecca like a fine blade. Some passengers behind her froze. The older woman from earlier, holding a travel magazine, stopped mid-page. A teenager in a hoodie with AirPods in removed one earbud. A nearby coffee shop worker glanced over, just to be sure he'd heard right. Rebecca said nothing. She pulled her hand back, stood tall, her face unchanged, but her eyes, those eyes showed she had weathered storms far worse than this, and survived. 3 minutes later, 2 airport security officers arrived, Martinez and Price, dressed in black jackets, TSA badges on display. They didn't rush, but they didn't smile either. They walked with the measured steps of people who had been briefed on an incoming threat. "Excuse me, ma'am. We've been asked to escort you for a secondary screening. Please come with us," Martinez said. He didn't touch her, but his gaze boxed her in, trying to frame her as suspicious. Rebecca answered calmly, "I have nothing to hide, but I'd like to know the official reason for this check. This is a documented trip." She held out her ID again. This time Price glanced at it, then looked away. No verification, no acknowledgement. "We're not here to argue, ma'am," Price said. "This is a directive. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Difficult? Rebecca nearly laughed. She remembered the times she sat in front of the budget committee, fighting for every dollar of funding for the district she represented, where half the children didn't have enough to eat. Times when she didn't cry, didn't raise her voice, didn't walk out, but simply pushed the budget sheet forward and asked, "Who are we leaving behind this quarter?" Compared to battles like those, this confrontation, in her eyes, was nothing. But it still shouldn't be happening. Not to her, not to anyone. She followed them toward a side hallway next to Gate 17, the kind of area most passengers never notice. A small gray door opened, leading into a narrow space, dimly lit by fluorescent bulbs. The smell of plastic, disinfectant-clean floors, and a thick silence hung like fog. All of this because she had asked a simple question: where was my seat moved to? And now she was labeled a disturbance. When they reached the screening room, Martinez lowered his voice. "We'll need to conduct a full inspection of your person and your luggage. Please place your bag on the table." Rebecca set her suitcase down, unzipped it. She no longer hoped to be treated properly. She just hoped they wouldn't tear through the things that belonged to her father. Inside the suitcase was a small fabric-wrapped box, holding an old fountain pen, a printed copy of the memorial remarks she planned to read, and a leather-bound notebook that Walter Kinsey had used for over 20 years, filled with thoughts, notes, and quiet verses. Martinez didn't notice. He skimmed over the items. Price patted her down with cold gloves, hands brushing over her arms, shoulders, back, without a word of explanation. Rebecca felt each touch as a public transaction between dignity and silence. She said nothing, but her eyes, still fixed on the ceiling, seemed to cling to the only thing they hadn't yet searched: her faith. 20 minutes passed. They left her alone on a cold metal chair against the wall. She checked the time. 7:12 a.m. The flight had taken off. Without her, without the farewell, without anyone saying, "We're sorry, we were wrong." She leaned down and quietly pulled her bag back toward her. With her own hands, she folded the printed speech and tucked it into her coat pocket. At that moment, her phone buzzed. A text appeared on the screen. "Almost there. It's me." She saw the name, Benjamin, and in that instant, her entire body, which had remained composed on the outside, exhaled, releasing the final layer of restraint. Not because she was afraid, but because the game they didn't know they were playing was about to end. Rebecca sat still on the cold chair against the wall, hands resting on her knees, back straight, eyes looking forward, as if she were sitting in a legislative hearing, not inside a sealed inspection room where she, a state legislator on an official trip, had just been treated like an anonymous security risk. The door behind her shut. Price and Martinez exited the room, leaving her alone with an unzipped suitcase, disheveled belongings, and a strange kind of silence. Not the quiet of calm, but a silence that felt intentionally hollow. She wasn't handcuffed, she wasn't charged, but she was treated as if her very presence was somehow an offense. A few minutes passed. She checked her phone. The flight had taken off more than 10 minutes ago. A notification from the airline stating boarding complete had arrived at 7:06. It was now 7:17. In that moment, Rebecca didn't feel tired. She felt cold. Not a physical cold, but the kind that comes when you're faced with a truth, that no matter how many titles you hold, how many documents you carry, or how much justice is on your side, if others don't believe you're worthy, they can still push you aside. Legally. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, then opened them, pulled out her phone, and typed a single line. "I was pulled. I missed the flight. I need you here." She hit send. No extra words, no exclamation marks, no explanation. Just a simple message, carrying immense weight. A soft knock at the door made her look up. Martinez returned. No smile, no apology. "We'll escort you back to the waiting area, but we need to retain you for internal reporting." Rebecca didn't respond. She stood up, repacked her things, zipped the suitcase. Her hands trembled slightly, not out of fear, but because she was holding back something larger. Rage. She left the room, walking back down the hallway, lit by sickly fluorescent lights, returning to the main terminal. A few people were still seated nearby. No one clapped. No one smiled. But many eyes had seen what happened. And one of those eyes belonged to Jaylyn, the young woman who had filmed the entire incident on her phone when Rebecca was told to step aside. Jaylyn wasn't a journalist. She wasn't a government worker. She was a sophomore majoring in media studies, just waiting for her flight home. But when she saw a black woman in a black dress, speaking calmly, being treated like a threat for simply asking, "Why was my seat changed?" she knew this needed to be recorded. And now that clip, less than a minute long, was being uploaded to TikTok with the caption, "This woman just asked why her seat got changed and got kicked off the flight. She didn't yell. She didn't cause a scene. They just didn't want her there." Rebecca sat down on the bench by the wall. She said nothing. Mallory and Cullen stood a few meters away at the counter. They avoided her eyes. The TSA officer stepped back toward the exit, offering no further comment. She wasn't waiting for an explanation. She had heard enough. And then, the automatic glass door at the terminal entrance slid open. A man walked in, tall, solid. His stride was unhurried but steady. A gray overcoat, a deep burgundy scarf, the same scarf Rebecca had knitted him for Christmas last year. His eyes were serious, not angry, but sharp like a cold blade. Benjamin Hayes, former federal Supreme Court Justice, Rebecca's husband, a man who, in 30 years, had never needed to raise his voice to command attention. He didn't look for her with his eyes. He found her by instinct and walked directly to where she was seated. "Are you okay?" Rebecca gave a slight nod. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He turned to face the TSA officers and airline staff standing in the distance. "Who's in charge here?" Martinez approached, visibly hesitant. "Excuse me, sir. And you are?" Benjamin's tone did not change. "Benjamin Hayes, former federal Supreme Court Justice. And I want to know why my wife was prevented from boarding her flight after checking in properly, presenting official ID, and being treated like a threat simply for asking a question." For a moment, the entire terminal seemed to fall silent. Mallory froze in place. Cullen turned away, pretending to check a monitor. A nearby woman murmured, "Oh my God," and whispered something to the person beside her. Another staff member quickly pulled out a phone to call a supervisor. And Jaylyn, the one who had filmed it all, was now live streaming. The view count was climbing by the second. Benjamin looked Martinez directly in the eye. "Did she yell?" "No, sir." "Did she disrupt anything?" "No." "Then who gave the order to call security, and why?" No one answered. No more excuses. No more procedures. Only the raw exposure of a poor decision, masked by cold behavior and misused authority. And Rebecca? She still sat quietly, but this time her eyes had shifted from endurance to observation. Because in that moment, she didn't have to say anything. She had already said enough. And now, it was time for the truth to speak for itself. The entire area in front of Gate 17 fell silent, as if someone had just sucked all the air out of the room. Benjamin stood there, no microphone, no temporary badge of authority, just the kind of integrity forged by 30 years on the bench. And everyone else? Frozen, heads bowed, eyes averted, fingers clutching their uniforms as if fabric might shield them from the shame now seeping into every cell. Martinez fumbled to respond, but Benjamin turned to Cullen, the first person who gave the order to call security. "You," he said, his voice low but heavy like forged iron. "What was the reason for calling security?" Cullen swallowed hard. "She wasn't cooperating." "Specifically, how did she not cooperate?" "She wouldn't step aside when asked." "Before or after you refused to verify her ID?" Cullen said nothing. Beads of sweat formed at his hairline. Benjamin stepped in, just half a stride closer, just enough to exert pressure, but not enough to cross the line. He wasn't threatening. He was demanding answers. "Do you even understand what you've done?" Cullen stared at the floor. Benjamin continued slowly, as if reading a formal indictment. You called security on a passenger who didn't scream, didn't curse, didn't threaten. You made a judgment based on her appearance and demeanor. You disregarded the government-issued ID of a state legislator on official business. And when she asked a perfectly normal question, you treated it as a disturbance. No one spoke. Another employee in a gray suit with a name tag that read, Ryan, rushed over. He looked like a supervisor. Out of breath, eyes darting, he wore the expression of a man who had just stepped into a mess with national implications. Judge Hayes, he began, extending his hand awkwardly. We sincerely apologize for what happened. This is certainly not the standard of service Atlantic Line strives for. Benjamin didn't shake his hand. He simply tilted his head. Then what exactly is Atlantic Line's standard, Mr. Ryan? Ignoring government identification? Calling security on passengers who don't match someone's visual standard? Randomly switching seats without notice? Sir, I'll need to review the procedural steps and speak with the team. Number, I'm not asking you about procedures. I'm asking about decisions, human decisions, made right here. Because machines don't call security. People do. Ryan hesitated. I understand. We're conducting an internal review. No, Benjamin interrupted, his eyes now flashing like lightning in a storm. You're not conducting a review. You're reacting to public outrage. If that video hadn't been recorded, if I hadn't shown up, Rebecca would still be sitting in that tiny room, treated like a threat. Rebecca, still seated quietly behind him, finally spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was as clear and cutting as a stream slicing through stone. And you should have investigated before he got here. Ryan turned to face her. Her gaze wasn't angry. It wasn't defensive. It was dense with disappointment, like a sorrow too deep to name. Ms. Hayes, I understand this is a serious matter. No, she cut him off. Not for me. Ryan blinked. It's not because I have a title that you owe me an apology. It's because you thought you could do this. To anyone. By now, a small crowd of passengers had gathered near the counter. No one was pushing forward, but all eyes were locked on the exchange, as if they instinctively knew this was a moment that would be retold for a long time. A middle-aged man leaned against a pillar, hands in his pockets. An elderly woman quietly lifted her phone to take a photo. Near a charging station, a young woman, Jay Lynn, was live streaming. The viewer count had reached tens of thousands. She said nothing. She just let the world see. Because this time, the story didn't need words. It told itself. Benjamin exhaled, not in relief, but in clarity. He saw it now. People were listening, not because he was a judge, not because Rebecca was a legislator, but because everyone had been the victim of a wrong glance, a name mispronounced, a question misunderstood, an expression that got you singled out, simply because you didn't look like the right kind of person. He turned back to Ryan. I didn't come here to demand an upgrade. I don't want a free meal voucher. I came because of my wife and because of the people who will never get what she has. No camera, no live stream, no one fighting back for them. If you don't understand how big this is, I'll make sure your entire system learns. No one moved. Rebecca stood up. She adjusted her coat, tugged gently at the zipper on her suitcase. Then she spoke. Not to any one person, but to all the eyes fixed on her. I don't need anyone to say sorry just to check a box. I just need one thing. Never assume silence means consent, and never assume appearance defines a person's worth. She turned to Benjamin and gave a soft nod. Let's go. And as they walked away from the airport, no one stopped them. No one handed them a voucher. No one offered a fake smile or a flimsy excuse. Only one thing remained beyond anyone's control. A wave had already begun to spread, and the truth was now alive. The airport doors closed behind them. No one called out. No staff rushed over to say, "Come back, we'll make it right." No apology vouchers, no seat upgrades, not even a polite smile. Just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, doesn't soothe, but is built from awkwardness, fear, and a touch of late regret. As they stepped out of the main terminal, Rebecca and Benjamin blended into the pale morning light of Florida. The sky was paper-thin gray, no rain, no sun, just dim enough to weigh down every feeling that hadn't yet found its way into words. Benjamin's car was parked in the short-term zone. He opened the trunk. Rebecca placed her suitcase inside, adjusting the straps carefully, as if that single act was holding her together. But she didn't get in. She stood beside the car, hands resting lightly on the edge of the door, eyes gazing back toward the airport as if waiting for someone to come out and apologize, even though she knew no one would. Not today. Not in this place. Benjamin came around and stood beside her. They said nothing. And in that quiet, the kind only people who've endured injustice together can recognize, he placed his hand on her shoulder, gently, not to comfort, not to coax, just to be present. Rebecca kept her eyes on the sky, not really seeing, but feeling. Feeling like she had been labeled a problem, a burden, someone who didn't fit, who was difficult, who asked questions at the wrong time. She hadn't yelled, hadn't obstructed, hadn't resisted. Yet somehow, she became someone who needed to be handled, all because she existed in a way that didn't fit someone else's expectations from behind a computer screen in a uniform. It wasn't the first time she'd been treated like this, but it was the first time she let herself go completely silent. Not out of weakness, but because she wanted to see how far they'd go when no one stopped them. And now, she knew. Her phone buzzed in her hand. 3 missed calls. 1 message from the memorial event organizers in Jacksonville. We waited 15 extra minutes. Mr. Kinsey's granddaughter was hoping you'd come, but the service had to begin. Rebecca closed her eyes, her lips pressed together, her fingers clenched slightly. She had made a promise to be there, to give a short tribute to the man who had taken her in when she was just a lost child in the state foster system. The man who once told her, "Rebecca, no matter what anyone says, you are not anyone's mistake." And now she felt like the mistake. She had missed the funeral, missed the chance to say goodbye, missed the most sacred part of being a daughter, honoring the one who raised you. Benjamin could feel the tension in her shoulder. He didn't urge her to get in the car. He just stood there, his hand still on her, like a tiny anchor trying to hold steady the storm inside her chest. "They didn't think I'd show up," he said quietly. Rebecca inhaled deeply. "They didn't think anyone would care." He nodded. "Now they know." Rebecca turned to him. Her eyes were red, but no tears fell. She didn't want to cry, not out of pride, but because she knew her tears would be misinterpreted. She wasn't weak. She was furious. But hers was a fury that made the world stop and listen. They got into the car. No music, no conversation. Just 2 people letting silence clear the road for something larger. A form of resistance that didn't scream, but was sharp enough to rip through layers of prejudice others still believed were invisible. Rebecca opened her phone. On TikTok, Jalen's video had already surpassed 146,000 views, and rising. The video was short, just 52 seconds. But in it, the world could see a black woman in a black dress, standing upright, holding her bag, being escorted silently by 2 security officers. Her eyes locked forward, not afraid, not defeated. And the caption beneath the video, "Why did she have to leave when she did nothing wrong?" The comments were a flood. "Same thing happened to me at Chicago O'Hare. They acted like my ID didn't exist. I'm not a public official, but I know that look, like you're trash. We need to name the airline. This can't be swept under the rug." Rebecca scrolled through them. She didn't reply, didn't share. She just read, soaking in the one truth that now echoed louder than anything else. For the first time, she wasn't alone in the feeling of being invisible. "They'll try to spin this," Benjamin said, eyes on the road. "They'll call it a misunderstanding, a policy issue, a tech glitch." Rebecca nodded gently. "But this time," she said, "they don't get to write the ending." Benjamin turned his head slightly, looking at his wife, the woman who had just been humiliated in public, but still sat upright, facing forward, as if the pain of this day was just one stop on a much longer road she was determined to finish. And somewhere online, under a video being shared at lightning speed, there was one pinned comment. She didn't scream, she didn't rage, but by standing still, she made the whole world listen. Benjamin Hayes was not someone who sought the spotlight. If asked at a party, He'd simply smile and introduce himself as retired. He wouldn't mention the 14 years on the federal appellate court, the landmark cases that shaped national law, or the fact that he had been the first black judge appointed to that position in the state of Georgia. He lived as if true power didn't need to be shown. It was simply felt when he entered a room. And that day, in his gray coat and the soft Bordeaux scarf Rebecca had hand-knit last Christmas, Benjamin didn't walk into the airport as a judge. He walked in as a husband who had received one short message from his wife. "I need you here. Not for a scandal, not for a camera, not to make anyone bow or apologize, but to look directly into the eyes of those who had harmed her and ask why." When the couple walked back into the main terminal, unannounced, unescorted, everything froze. Not because people recognized him, but because they recognized that he didn't need recognition to make them uneasy. Cullen had disappeared from the counter. Mallory stood behind the desk, pretending to adjust boarding passes, as if she hadn't helped make a decision with national consequences. Ryan, the area supervisor, was still there, whispering into his phone like a man desperate to contain the crisis. Benjamin walked forward without asking, without stopping, and stood directly in front of Ryan, his voice calm and steady, not needing volume to command. "We need to talk. Now." Ryan hung up the call. He nodded. Of course. We're ready to assist in any way we can." Benjamin tilted his head. "Ready to assist? After you've already done the damage? After my wife was removed from a flight? After a passenger with valid government ID and a confirmed ticket was labeled disruptive, simply for asking why her seat was changed?" Ryan swallowed. I truly apologize for the incident. We'll be reviewing the staff involved, and if necessary, we can arrange a seat on the next." "She doesn't need another seat," Benjamin interrupted. "She needs the truth, and you owe her that, not as a customer, but as a human being." Rebecca said nothing. She stood beside him, arms crossed, her gaze dissecting every twitch on Ryan's face. This time her silence wasn't patience. It was a test. Benjamin continued, his voice growing colder. Not with malice, but with the chill of justice that no longer had time for diplomacy. "You changed her seat, without notice. When she asked, you gave no answer. When she showed ID, you didn't look. When she spoke calmly, you called security." Ryan stammered. "We were just following security protocol. There might have been a misunderstanding and—" "Misunderstanding?" Benjamin raised an eyebrow, his expression dipping, for the first time that morning, into something that resembled irony. "What kind of misunderstanding makes someone look at a black woman in a black dress on her way to a funeral and see a threat? What misunderstanding leads you to call security instead of offering an explanation?" Ryan was speechless. Someone in the small crowd nearby gave a single clap, then silence again, thick with pressure. That's when a voice came from behind the desk. "Mr. Hayes." Cullen. He had returned, summoned by someone backstage. Pale, gaunt, fingers clenched at the hem of his uniform, like a man unsure of how to ask for forgiveness. Benjamin turned to face him. "Were you the first to assist my wife this morning?" Cullen nodded. "Were you the one who called security?" Cullen nodded again, eyes downcast. Benjamin stepped closer, not louder, not angrier, but now less a question and more the pronouncement of a verdict. "Do you know what your actions are called legally?" Cullen stayed silent. "Targeted escalation, a form of covert abuse of authority when someone is singled out not for their actions, but for their presence. When someone is turned into a problem, not because of what they did, but because of how they were seen. You looked at her and decided someone like her shouldn't ask questions, shouldn't inquire, shouldn't exist outside the box you assigned." Cullen's breathing grew heavy. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. "And that, Mr. Cullen, is bias." A PR rep had arrived. A senior manager, female, glasses, iPad in hand, polished expression, cold smile. "We will be issuing an official statement within 24 hours. Rebecca, after 10 minutes of silence, finally turned to her. "Don't issue anything." "I'm sorry? I mean, don't try to rewrite this as a technical glitch. This didn't happen because someone forgot to update the system. It happened because someone looked at me and decided I wasn't worth engaging. And if there hadn't been a camera, a clip, or this man walking in, she pointed to Benjamin, then I would have left this place in silence, labeled difficult, uncooperative, and probably filed under an internal report that said, passenger failed to comply. No one argued, no one denied it, because for the first time in that long, worn-out system, someone had stood up, not with shouting, but with precision. Benjamin looked around and nodded slightly. Therefore, I ask and insist that from this moment forward, you stop addressing us as customers. Address us as citizens, because this is no longer the story of one person. This is the question every system must answer. Who have we dismissed simply because they didn't come with a title? Rebecca turned to her husband. Her eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. I don't need an apology. Benjamin met her gaze. He didn't speak, just nodded. I need them to understand. Dignity isn't something to be earned. It's default, for everyone. The story didn't end at gate 17. In truth, it had only just begun. Literally. The difference this time was that no one could control how it would end. Less than an hour after Rebecca and Benjamin left Orlando West Terminal, the clip of the incident, recorded by a college student named Jaylyn, surpassed 1 million views on TikTok. The video was under a minute long, but within its frame you could clearly see a black woman in a black dress calmly exiting the TSA screening area, escorted by 2 officers. No resistance, no shouting, nothing that met the definition of disruptive, and that's exactly why the video struck a nerve. No dramatic background music, no flashy captions, just a single question pinned on screen. Why was she taken away when she did nothing wrong? Hundreds of thousands began sharing the clip as if they were sharing their own memories. It wasn't just outrage, it was recognition, a deep personal kind. I've been her. A black doctor in Atlanta wrote, I wore a white coat and had my ID badge on, but hospital security still asked me, who are you looking for? A high school teacher from Nevada commented, they called me the maid because I wore jeans to parent night. Not one person asked who I was before they decided what I was. An elderly man in Minnesota shared, I had my luggage searched at the airport because my name didn't sound friendly. All I had was a U.S. passport and a bitter silence. The hashtags #, gate 17, #, she didn't yell, and #, Rebecca Hayes spread faster than any media campaign ever could. Celebrities, activists, university professors, even people who had never cared much for politics, began speaking up. What scared the people who thought this would fade like every other story was this. Rebecca didn't do anything wrong. She also didn't do anything extraordinary. She just stood there. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't argue. She simply existed, and that was treated as a threat. That alone cracked something open in millions of people's chests. When silence is deep enough, it turns into thunder. Rebecca didn't post a speech, didn't appear on television, didn't accept any interview requests. Instead, she simply reshared Jaylyn's video with one quiet caption. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been told they didn't belong, even when they did. The comments exploded. One person wrote, she didn't raise her voice, but she raised a generation. Another said, the silence she carried was louder than any protest. A user in Canada wrote, I saw my mother in her. I saw my sister. I saw the day I was told I was too loud, just for speaking up. Rebecca read every comment in silence, not to reply, but to listen. Because for the first time in a long time, all the pains that had once been dismissed as small were now being named by an entire nation. Mainstream media couldn't ignore it. CNN reported, state representative removed from flight after questioning gate change. The New York Times ran, the silent protest at gate 17. Even Fox News, typically conservative, published a piece on inappropriate treatment of a government official. But what surprised Benjamin and Rebecca most didn't come from the news. It came from handwritten letters, from personal emails, from students, veterans, nurses, restaurant workers, truck drivers, people who had experienced their own version of what happened to Rebecca, but had no camera to capture it. A 64-year-old woman wrote, I was pushed out of the check-in line for standing at the wrong gate while on my way to my husband's funeral. No one filmed it, but today you spoke for me. And perhaps the most moving of all was a single comment pinned beneath the video. Just one sentence. She didn't scream, but the world heard her anyway. Are you still following this story? If you've ever felt judged, excluded, or deemed not good enough simply because you didn't fit someone else's idea of what's right, then this is your story too. Like and subscribe to this channel if you believe true stories matter, where silence can echo farther than a scream. Because justice doesn't need to be loud, but it must be seen. 2 days after the incident at Gate 17, while social media continued to roar, while the hashtags remained in the trending ranks, and while news networks scrambled for exclusive interview angles, Rebecca Hayes remained silent. She turned down every invitation for morning talk shows, declined the 9 p.m. news, even refused to appear at a press conference her own office had hurriedly arranged to clarify the incident. She didn't want the story to become a political backdrop, and she certainly didn't want to become another label for the media to file under their tired narrative arc of Black woman humiliated, then celebrated, then forgotten. Rebecca knew what would happen if she stepped into that cycle. She had seen too many people turned into symbols, only to later be viewed as obstacles to reconciliation once public sentiment shifted. She didn't want to be a meme on a t-shirt or a poster in some politician's office. She just wanted to talk about what actually happened, about what should never happen to anyone, title or no title. That evening, in a quiet third-floor room of a small Jacksonville beachside hotel, Rebecca opened her laptop, switched on the desk lamp, and began typing. She wrote a letter. Not to the media, not to the press, but to the public. The people who had messaged her, called her office, sent handwritten letters to the state capitol. She wrote, "What happened to me isn't new. What's new is, this time someone filmed it, someone watched, someone didn't look away. But I don't want to be remembered for staying silent at the right moment. I want this story to not need to happen again to anyone." She recounted the events, from the first glance, to the impatient tone, to the moment a simple question was treated as a threat. Then she wrote, "I don't speak about racial bias as an academic concept. I speak about the look, the tone, the imbalance of power, the things that don't show up in reports but live inside every small decision. And when people say, well, maybe they didn't know who you were, that only proves to me that we've accepted a system where only people with titles are deemed worthy of basic decency." The letter wasn't long, but when it was published on the official state website the next morning, it was quoted across every platform. One line in particular was bolded, underlined, and reshared tens of thousands of times. Dignity is not something granted through recognition. It is a default right for everyone. The media narrative began to shift. Articles no longer centered around a lawmaker humiliated, but started asking deeper questions. How many others have been treated this way without a camera? A major magazine headline read, "Rebecca Hayes' silence sparked the conversation America avoided." A university invited her to speak during Human Rights Week. A racial equity nonprofit asked her to serve as an honorary advisor. Even a few airlines quietly revised their complaint intake processes and retrained staff on bias-free communication. She accepted none of it. She sent the same reply to every invitation. "I don't need recognition. I need change." Benjamin sat beside her in the living room, sipping hot tea while scrolling the news. He watched his wife, not with the fiery eyes she used in legislative debate, nor with the ice-cold stare from the TSA screening room, but with the gaze of someone who knew this story wasn't over. Rebecca looked up from her laptop. "Do you think I'm doing the right thing?" she asked. Benjamin folded his newspaper and paused. "You're not winning," he said. "You're reclaiming the truth, and that's the right thing." In a world obsessed with doing things fast, loud, and dramatic, Rebecca chose a different path. No slogans, no headlines, no chants. She chose to move slowly, but surely, turning a personal moment into a collective reminder. Because she knew, if they could do that to a state legislator, they could do it to anyone. And this time, even if she didn't shout, She would not let it pass in silence. It was a Friday afternoon, warmer than usual, with a light breeze but no chill. A day that felt ordinary in the suburbs of Tallahassee, except for one thing. The Southside Community Hall had been packed since 3 p.m. Even though the event wasn't scheduled to begin until 4, there was no keynote speaker beforehand, no MC, no music. The room held nearly 200 people, but it was silent, as if everyone knew they hadn't come to hear a state representative pitch a new bill. They hadn't come to complain about potholes or healthcare costs. They had come because of one quiet question stirring in their hearts. If this happened to Rebecca, who would protect me? The doors swung open. Rebecca walked in. No entourage, no press trailing behind, no power blazer. Just a plain white button-down shirt, gray khaki pants, and her curly hair pulled back in a low tie. She didn't look like a political figure. She looked like a teacher walking into class, a mother at a parent-teacher conference, a citizen, just like everyone else in the room. And because of that, the entire hall fell still as she stepped up to the microphone. Rebecca didn't begin with the pledge, no long list of thank yous. She just took a deep breath and looked around. This week, she began, I'm not here to talk about budgets or resolution drafts. I came to tell a story, and it might just be your story too. The air tightened. People sat straighter in their chairs. Rebecca began to speak, every detail, the way the counter agent looked at her, like she wasn't someone who had the right to ask questions, the way they called security, not because of her behavior, but because of a bias, the way she stood still, not because she chose silence, but because she wanted to see how far they'd go if no one stopped them. She spoke about missing the funeral, about the foster father who taught her what kindness meant, and how devastating it felt when that kindness was denied its dignity. But most importantly, she spoke of the one thing she didn't say that day, but felt deeply. I wasn't hurt because I missed a flight. I was hurt because that kind of dismissal is so familiar. Too often people look at me, at us, and decide we don't fit. Not polished enough, not the right kind, not worth explaining to. A soft inhale echoed from the middle row. A woman nodded quietly. A young man in a hoodie wiped his eyes with his sleeve, sitting by the window. Rebecca paused. Her gaze swept the room, gently tracing each expression. But here's the thing, she continued. What they didn't expect is that silence could travel this far. What they didn't expect was that a woman who didn't yell, didn't pound her fists, didn't rage, could make an entire nation listen. At the back of the hall stood Marcus, a first-year criminal justice student. He had emailed Rebecca's office 3 days earlier, never expecting to be invited to the town hall. He was the first to raise his hand. Ms. Hayes, he asked, how did you stay so calm? Rebecca smiled. You think you need to be angry to be respected, and you're not wrong. Anger is valid, but there's another kind of strength. It's when you know that anger is burning inside you, and you choose not to let it blur the truth. You let it become a voice that doesn't need to shout. Marcus nodded slowly. An older man stood up. His voice was hoarse. I'm not a politician. I don't go online. But my granddaughter showed me that video of you getting kicked out of the airport. You don't know. That girl cried. She said, Grandpa, that happened to me once at school. I thought it was my fault. He paused. Thank you for standing there, so she knows it wasn't. The room applauded, not thunderously, but steadily, like rain tapping on a tin roof. Not loud, but real. Rebecca nodded, then lowered the mic. Thank you. I didn't come here for applause. I came to acknowledge something. We've been quiet for too long, and kindness doesn't have to scream, but it does have to stand up. As people began rising from their chairs, gathering their things, Rebecca reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was the letter she had posted online, but this time it had one handwritten line at the bottom. If you've ever felt like you didn't belong, I'm here to remind you, you've always belonged, and you have the right to take up space without asking permission. She pinned it to the community corkboard in the hallway, the one usually filled with bake sale flyers, church invitations, and lost pet notices. Among all the colorful papers and busy announcements, it was the only page that needed no color to be seen. There was no grand finale, no ribbon cutting, no media photo op with a backdrop reading "Justice Served," no primetime news anchor wrapping the segment with, "And finally she got her apology." No one patted Rebecca Hayes on the back and said, "We've changed. Thank you." Because in real life, justice doesn't arrive in a crescendo. It often comes late and quietly. 1 week after the town hall in Tallahassee, Rebecca left her office early, carrying a small tote bag, a leather notebook, and a phone barely charged. She wasn't headed to a meeting or a hearing. She walked, no security, no escort, toward Union Station, the kind of place where those who need no welcome and expect no send-off come and go in silence. She chose a stone bench under a nameless tree near the local bus stop. No one recognized her. No one whispered her name. And that was exactly what she needed. Rebecca opened her notebook. She had been writing in it all week. Notes, thoughts, questions, and responses from people who had sent letters, emails, and handwritten messages to her office. They weren't rallying. They weren't shouting. They just said, "I've been her too." A Black doctor wrote that she had once been stopped at the entrance of her own hospital for wearing jeans that didn't match the dress code. A single mother shared how she was asked to leave a clinic because her son cried too loudly, and I didn't look like I could control my family. A 15-year-old boy was told to leave a bakery because he stood too long near the bread shelf. They weren't asking for help. They just wanted someone to see them and not look away. Rebecca placed her hand on the page and wrote slowly, "To those without a name in the system, those not on the priority list, no VIP badge, no one to step in when you're insulted in public. If you've ever been ignored for speaking up, if you've ever felt the need to apologize for simply existing, if you've ever been pulled out of line, out of a seat, out of an opportunity, just because you didn't look the part, then please know this. You are not wrong. You do not need to change yourself to be respected. You don't need a title, a platform, or a following to be heard. Dignity is not a reward. It is a default right." She sat there for a while. Time moved like water under a bridge, not rushed, not paused, just flowing. People passed by. Some laughed, talked on phones, wheeled their luggage, waited for buses. No one knew that the woman in a white shirt on that old bench was the same person who had forced an airline to rewrite its entire passenger conduct policy. No one knew her silence had become a voice for millions, and for Rebecca, that was enough. A group of students walked by. A tall boy with curly hair and a backpack glanced back. "You're the woman in the airport video, right?" he asked. Rebecca smiled. "Maybe." He nodded. "You didn't say anything, but we all got it." She asked softly, "Has that ever happened to you?" He replied, "Yeah, a lot. But after that video, we talked to our homeroom teacher. She let us start a group called The Scene, so anyone who feels ignored can speak up." Rebecca looked at him and said nothing more, but her eyes shimmered as if receiving something precious that needed no wrapping. That evening, she returned to her small Capitol Hill apartment. Benjamin was brewing tea. They didn't turn on the TV. She simply sat at her desk, pulled out the old boarding pass from drawer, Flight 6172, where it all began, and placed it between the pages of her notebook. She wrote one more line beside it. "I didn't need to make that flight. I just needed others, moving forward, not to be removed in silence." The following week, during a policy intern roundtable on civil rights, a young student, braided hair, round glasses, asked her, "Do you think people really learned anything from what happened?" Rebecca paused before answering. "Maybe not everyone, but someone will stop and think, and that person will teach someone else." She added, "Sometimes the biggest lesson isn't how we react when the camera's on. It's how we treat people when no one is watching." Not a dramatic ending, not a neat and everything got better, just a necessary one. The kind that reminds us, if you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or labeled as trouble, you are not alone. And you don't have to stay silent. Keep your gaze steady, your voice clear, and your heart unwavering. Because kindness doesn't need a microphone. It just needs to be chosen, every day. And in the end, this story is no longer just about Rebecca Hayes. It's about every moment we were quietly pushed aside, not with shouts, but with glances, tones, and systemized silence. It's about the middle-aged man mistaken for the janitor in the office he manages. The black woman asked 3 times, "Who are you here to see?" in a hotel she had already booked. The boy kept outside the classroom because his hoodie didn't meet expectations. And above all, it's about us, the ones who stayed quiet until someone finally spoke for us. Rebecca never needed to shout, because it was in how she stood still, without stepping back, that millions moved forward. Now imagine, what if she hadn't been a state legislator? What if no one had filmed it? What if no one had waited at the terminal to ask, "Why was my wife removed?" What would have happened? The answer is, it would have continued, and it still will, if we do nothing. But this isn't a sad ending, because since that clip, a 17-year-old girl rewrote her college essay about no longer apologizing for her skin. A school created a support group for students who felt excluded, and one anonymous airport employee wrote to Rebecca, "I used to be like Cullen, but next time, I won't stay silent." That is the real ending, not in this video, not in the description, but in how we act, starting now, when no one's filming and no one's watching. Because dignity is not a gift. It doesn't come from badges, titles, or follower counts. It's the default right of every person, even if all they do is stand still, ask one question, or attend their father's funeral. If this story made you cry, made you angry, or simply reminded you of a time you stayed silent, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to know they were never wrong and they are never alone. So that next time, when another Rebecca walks up to the check-in counter, they look up and greet her before they look at her ticket.